good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see you all. If virtually, it'd be better to see you all in person, but this is good too. It's first week of the semester here at Shepherd, and we're kind of wrapping up our summer and beginning the fall series of programs. And today we have a really special program for you all, featuring our friend and colleague from the U.S. Senate Historical Office, Betty Koed. Betty is the U.S. Senate historian and the director of the Senate Historical Office. So before we get started, I'm going to run through just kind of the basics. And I know some of you have joined us multiple times for our programs this summer, but for those of you who haven't, I'm going to ask that you all mute your mics and turn off your cameras for Betty's presentation. And we'll go with a standard format today. Betty will give her talk, and then we'll have Q&A. And you can submit, you can turn your cameras on for the Q&A, but we'll ask that you keep your mics muted. And we'll open the chat feature, which is, go to the toolbar, I think it should be at the bottom of your Zoom window. There's a little icon that says chat. And so if you click that, it'll open up the chat box, and you can submit your questions through that. And Jody and I will sort of pick them, and we'll provide them for Betty, and she can answer questions during the Q&A.
I'll just give you one person.
And then, and in the same sense, as if we were meeting in person, I do just ask that in sort of putting those questions out there that you submit questions and not comments, and that hopefully we can just kind of keep them brief too, so we can keep things moving. So that's the way we're going to do things for today's program. Many of you know that over the course of the summer, we've been focusing our programming on critical points in American history wherein broader societal arguments about race and racism, citizenship, equality, social justice have been taken up by Congress, the members of the House, as we saw last month when Dr. Michael Woods talked about the gag rule. And today we'll talk about sort of the Senate's efforts in some of these areas. And our hope is that these programs can provide some much needed historical context sorry, I lost my train of thought. Our hope is that these programs can provide some context, much needed historical context to the conversations that we're having right now and that we've been having for a long time in this country. Hopefully they'll help you better understand the history of Congress, the history of the Constitution, and the history of representative democracy in America, particularly as it pertains to race and civil rights. And so that is really the goal. I said in my introduction for Dr. Woods, for those of you who saw us, that congressional engagement on civil rights issues is very much sort of reflected that of the nation, with some actions reflecting our worst impulses and others sort of reflecting our better angels, so to speak. And I think that today's talk, which is titled "To March Ahead of His Followers, Charles Sumner and the Civil Rights Act of 1875, focuses on the drive to point America towards the latter, right, towards our better angels. It's an inspiring and I think a bittersweet story, and I'm not going to give any of it away because Betty tells it far better than I do, and she's our guest speaker. And so I'm not going to tell you more about that. I do want to tell you a little bit about Betty. As I mentioned, she is the U.S. Senate historian and director of the Senate Historical Office. She earned her PhD in political and public history at the University of California, Santa Barbara prior to joining the Senate Historical Office. In 2016, Betty was awarded UCSB's Distinguished Alumni Award, and she was appointed Senate historian in 2015. Betty supervises all historical and archival projects, provides talks and presentations to senators, their staffs, and the public on wide-ranging topics of Senate history, including Senator Byrd. She conducts oral histories with senators and their staffs, Betty is also the senior editor of the Biographical Directory of Congress, and she has served on the editorial board of the Public Historian, which is the premier academic journal for public history. She is also a former officer of the Society for History in the federal government. And before I turn things over to Betty, I do want to take a moment to thank those of you who have made contributions to support the Byrd Center over the past couple months. They are very much appreciated for those of us here at the center, Jody and myself and our board of directors. And to those of you who haven't but are maybe considering supporting us, I encourage you to do so by visiting byrdcenter.org. Again, our programs are donor supported and we cannot conduct them without your ongoing generosity. So please do consider that, byrdcenter.org. So I'm going to turn it over to Betty now. I'm going to mute my microphone and sit back and enjoy this fantastic talk. So take it away, Betty.
Thank you, Jay. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Jay, can you see my slide there okay?
I can.
Okay, good. We're off. Well, as a Senate historian, I spend a lot of time trying to dispel myths about Senate history and about the Capitol. Some of these old stories have been around for so long that they're practically carved in stone. There are also stories that are quite true, but in the telling and retelling of those stories, they take on mythical qualities. One such story is the caning of Charles Sumner. Now, most of you probably know this story, but just in case, in May of 1856, the great abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner delivered a fiery speech denouncing those who supported slavery and its expansion into the Western territories. 2 days later, a South Carolina representative named Preston Brooks found Sumner at his desk in the Senate chamber and brutally attacked him with his heavy walking stick, leaving Sumner bleeding and unconscious on the chamber floor. It was a pivotal moment in Senate history, and every Capitol visitor who enters the old Senate chamber hears the story in some form, often with lots of inaccurate details thrown in for drama, especially if the person telling the story happens to be a member of Congress. This event has become a part of Capitol lore, but left unsaid is all the rest of that story. A couple of years ago, I was walking through the Capitol. As I passed by the old Senate chamber, I overheard a young staff member talking to a group of visitors. He told the story of the caning of Sumner with great dramatic flourish, and when he finished, one of the visitors asked, "Well, what happened next?" "Oh," the staffer replied, "Sumner just gave up and went home." Well, I knew then I had to do something. All too often in the Capitol and in many other historic settings, history is presented as a series of dramatic but isolated events with little context and even less accuracy. It's become part of my mission as Senate historian to push people, including senators, beyond these familiar stories to understand the rest of the Senate's history. I refuse to repeat tired old myths about the golden age of the Senate, and I've moved any discussion of Sumner from the old Senate chamber to the current chamber. In other words, I moved him from 1856 to the 1870s. Because contrary to what those visitors were told that day, Sumner did not give up. He was badly injured and his recovery took time, but in fact, he never totally recovered. But Sumner did return to the Senate in 1859 and served another 15 years. By the 1850s, Charles Sumner had been a strong voice for abolition for 2 decades. Like many abolitionists, incidents in his early life proved to be transformative. In 1834, he had his first real encounter with the realities of slavery. And then in 1838, while traveling in Paris, the 27-year-old Sumner attended a lecture there. "I noticed 2 or 3 blacks standing in the midst of a knot of young men, and their colors seemed to be of no objection," Sumner wrote in his journal. "I was glad to see this, though with American impressions, it seemed very strange. It must be then that the distance between free black and whites is derived from education and does not exist in the nature of things." Now that may seem self-evident to us today, but in 1838, it came as a revelation to Charles Sumner. Of particular importance to Sumner throughout his career was equal access to education, and he was among the first to call for the desegregation of public schools. In 1849, as a young lawyer in Boston, still 2 years away from his Senate service, Sumner represented 5-year-old Sarah Roberts before the Massachusetts Supreme Court in the legal case Roberts versus the City of Boston. More than a century before the landmark 1954 decision in Brown versus Board of Education, Sumner insisted that Boston's segregated public schools were inherently unequal. He insisted that racial segregation not only forced Black students to attend inferior schools, but also subjected them to psychological trauma. We cannot brand a whole race with the stigma of inferiority and degradation, he told the court. We cannot violate that fundamental right of citizens, equality before the law. In arguing this case, Sumner did a couple of interesting things. First, he brought the concept of equality before the law to the forefront, and that became his quest throughout his long struggle for civil rights. Second, he interpreted legal rights in a way that was not based solely on precedent and past action, but upon the social realities of the day. Sumner's willingness to look not just broadly at the Constitution, but actually beyond it, noted one legal scholar, meant that he saw a world where the realities of social change confront the equally powerful realities of vested ideas. A similar view would be argued by Louis Brandeis in the 1920s. Sumner may have shadowed those 20th century legal arguments, but he lost this court case. Nevertheless, his efforts helped to stir legislative action. In 1855, Massachusetts adopted the nation's first school desegregation law. These efforts at desegregation also extended to public transportation, and I'll give you just one example. In 1863, when considering a charter establishing the Washington and Alexandria Railroad, now Senator Sumner insisted on including one key sentence in that charter, that no person shall be excluded from the cars on account of color. 5 years later, an African-American Senate employee named Kate Brown suffered severe injuries when she was forcibly removed from the whites-only ladies' car of that local train. Sumner called for an investigation, encouraged Brown to sue the railroad company, and supported her legal case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1873, the Supreme Court upheld a lower court decision, rejected the railroad company's separate but equal argument as an ingenious attempt to evade the compliance with the obvious meaning of the charter, and ruled in favor of Kate Brown. That proved to be one of Sumner's few legal successes. These examples of Sumner's fight for civil rights deserve more attention than I'm giving them, but today I want to focus on his last great battle for civil rights. In 1865, when the Civil War ended and the 13th Amendment was ratified, slavery was abolished. For most senators, the fight ended there. But for Sumner, the battle had only just begun. Sumner insisted that emancipation was just the first step in ending slavery. Neither the rebellion nor slavery is yet ended, he stated. The rebellion has been disarmed, but that is all. Slavery has been abolished in name, but that is all. The work of liberation is not yet completed. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments provided African Americans with citizenship and gave Black men a foundation for voting rights, but they did not address the broader issues of racial discrimination. My desire, the darling desire of my soul, Sumner proclaimed, is to close forever this great question, so that it shall never again intrude into these chambers, so that hereafter in all our legislation there shall be no such words as black or white, but that we shall speak only of citizens. In 1870, in a move that put him decades ahead of most of his colleagues, Sumner introduced a bold civil rights bill to outlaw racial discrimination in all areas of public accommodation. Now, I'll try not to get too bogged down in legislative detail today, but if you'll bear with me, I would like to cover some of the highlights. On May 13, 1870, Sumner introduced a bill to ensure the equal and impartial enjoyment of any accommodation, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The bill was supplementary, he noted, to the 1866 Civil Rights Law, and it proposed to secure equal rights in railroads, steamboats, public conveyances, hotels, theaters, houses of public entertainment, common schools, institutions of learning, church institutions, cemeteries, and juries in courts, national and state. Sumner then went on to say, rather ambitiously and perhaps a bit naively, that if this bill became law, I know nothing further to be done in the way of legislation for the security of equal rights in this republic. In a pattern that became repetitive, the Senate referred the bill to the Judiciary Committee, and there it quietly died. So quietly, in fact, that Sumner didn't even know that it died. At the time, Illinois Senator Lyman Trumbull chaired the Judiciary Committee. Trumbull and Sumner had often agreed on principle, but rarely agreed on method. Throughout the Civil War, for example, they had fought over who would control the Senate's consideration of the 13th Amendment. That antagonism continued into the post-war period and influenced the course of Sumner's Civil Rights Bill. On January 20th, 1871, thinking his bill still rested in the Judiciary Committee, Sumner called for committee action. There must be equal rights in cars, in steamboats, in hotels, in schools, everywhere, in every institution, or in every place that has had the sanction of existing law. Trumbull, who happened to be present in the chamber at the time, responded with, "What bill? I do not think there is any such bill before the committee." Well, angry, Sumner replied, "It must have been reported then with a bundle of other bills so as to attract no attention. I didn't know it had been reported." Of course, that's exactly what happened. Trumbull used the busy final days of a session to report Sumner's bill out of committee with an adverse report. This left Sumner no choice but to reintroduce his bill. Again, the Senate referred the bill to the Judiciary Committee, and again, on February 15, 1871, Trumbull and his allies killed it. Some argued that it was an unconstitutional exercise of government authority, while others stated it was made unnecessary by ratification of the 14th Amendment. Many worried that Sumner's true goal was social equality, a goal that they were unwilling to support. Notably, in what passed as debate on this bill at this stage, Sumner barely addressed issues of constitutionality. He insisted that the bill was in conformity with the Constitution, but placed much more emphasis on the Declaration of Independence, neither of which, he argues, knows anything of the word white. For Sumner, the defining document was not the Constitution, but the Declaration. The question always on his mind was, could the United States live up to its founding principle that all men are created equal? Not deterred by Trumbull's action, Sumner again introduced the bill, this time calling for full Senate action. This bill has already been twice reported adversely upon by the Committee on the Judiciary, he told his colleagues in March of 1871. I think, therefore, it will not be advisable to refer it again to that committee. No resolution of adjournment should be adopted until the bill I now hold in my hand, or something equivalent to it, becomes a law. Sumner's pleas fell on deaf ears. The bill was printed, set aside, and no further action was taken. It was time to adopt a new strategy. As this legislative tug of war continued, the Senate was also considering a bill that became the Amnesty Act of 1872. Authorized by Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, Congress had the power, by a 2/3 vote of each House, to provide leniency to many who had supported the Confederacy, thereby allowing them to serve in public office. Widely supported among Democrats and many Southern Republicans, the amnesty bill also gained the backing of a number of Northern Republicans who had just grown weary of Reconstruction. With the amnesty bill under consideration, Sumner spotted an opportunity. He attached his civil rights bill as an amendment to the amnesty bill. Why shouldn't an act of generosity towards former Confederates be matched with an act of justice for the freedmen, Sumner asked. Knowing that his amendment would face fierce opposition, Sumner returned to his core argument. His aim was not social equality. The law does not presume to create or regulate social relations. Everyone was free to choose their companions. Instead, he sought civil equality, equality before the law. Show me a legal institution, he insisted, anything created or regulated by law, and I will show you what must be open equally to all without distinction of color. Sumner's actions temporarily stalled progress on the amnesty bill. The Senate would have to vote on his amendment before it could approve or reject the larger bill. This is when the real debate began. Some senators argued that such a law was already on the books in individual states and therefore unnecessary, but most objected on constitutional grounds. It makes every tavern keeper the state in which he lives, remarked Ohio Senator Alan G. Thurman. Every manager of a theater, every conductor of a railroad becomes the state in which he lives. Matthew Carpenter of Wisconsin attacked Sumner's inclusion of churches. That was clearly a violation of the First Amendment, he argued. Sumner replied, all the bill proposes is that those who enjoy the benefits of law shall treat those who come to them with equality. As the debate continued into the early months of 1872, Sumner presented petitions and testimonials from African Americans who had been denied equal access. The great abolitionist Frederick Douglass, when serving on a presidential commission, had been denied the privilege of dining with other commissioners. African Americans holding state offices in the South were denied passage on rail cars because of their race. Needless to say, Sumner never lacked evidence for widespread racial discrimination, but less convincing were his arguments, his answers to questions of constitutionality. When Lot Morrill of Maine acknowledged discrimination but found no power within the Constitution to stop it, Sumner replied, he finds no power in the Constitution for anything unless it be distinctly written in positive, precise words. He cannot read between the lines. For Sumner, the question was not constitutional. It was a question of morality. The only constitutional justification he needed was the 13th Amendment. Although ratified in 1865, Sumner argued that the 13th Amendment had never been fully implemented. As long as discrimination continued, he thundered at one point, the ancient criminal of slavery yet lingers among us. Finally, on February 9, 1872, Sumner's amendment to the amnesty bill came to a vote, and it tied 28-28 with a number of senators absent. Vice President Schuyler Colfax, a Republican from Indiana, hoping to assure African Americans of the Grant administration's support for civil rights, broke the tie with an affirmative vote. With Sumner's amendment intact, the amnesty bill failed to receive its necessary two-thirds vote and went down to defeat later that day. When the Senate returned to the issue of amnesty a few months later, the House of Representatives had already passed its own version of the bill, and so Senate debate on the House bill began on May 8th. Sumner again attached his civil rights bill, and tempers flared. I know of no civil right that I have that a colored man has not, insisted Sumner's old friend, Lyman Trumbull. I know of no right to ride in a car, no right to stop at a hotel, no right to travel possessed by the white man that the colored man has not. Maryland Senator George Vickers added, this provision is a direct invasion of private right and a violation, if not of the letter, then of the spirit of the Constitution. Sumner's supporters countered, arguing that the amendment asserted no new rights, but provided a means to ensure existing rights. On May 9, 1872, the Sumner Amendment again came to a vote. It tied 28-28, just as before. Again, the Vice President broke the tie with a yay vote. The Senate then proceeded to vote a second time on the amnesty bill, with Sumner's rider intact, and failed to gain the necessary two-thirds vote. It was a deadlock. Sumner's civil rights bill lived on, but not for long. It ended in a late-night session on May 21, 1872, while Sumner was absent. By this time, not only did Sumner suffer the lingering effects of that infamous beating, he was coping with a deteriorating heart condition that often robbed him of strength and endurance. Now, tired and weak from the long Senate session, he was at home resting. In his absence, supporters of the amnesty bill pushed through a watered-down version of his amendment. Aroused from sleep, Sumner rushed back to the chamber to make a last-ditch effort to save his civil rights amendment, asking for a reconsideration of the vote. Mr. President, I understand that in my absence and without any notice to me from any quarter of the Senate, it has adopted an emasculated civil rights bill with two essential safeguards wanting. One concerning the common schools and the other concerning the jury. Knowing that time was running out, he warned of consequences. The spirit of racial caste will receive new sanction in the education of children. Justice will find a new impediment in the jury box. Sir, I plead for the colored race who unhappily have no representative on this floor. When the amnesty bill became law on May 22, 1872, it did so without Sumner's civil rights rider, which failed to pass conference. With his hopes for a passage of the civil rights bill all but dashed, and the session coming to an end, a disheartened and increasingly unwell Sumner left town to fuel his recovery elsewhere. By the time the 43rd Congress convened in December of 1873, Sumner was back in the Senate, somewhat refreshed from his travels, but clearly in failing health. Not surprisingly, he immediately reintroduced his civil rights bill. Despite his demands for full consideration, the bill was referred to its old graveyard, the Judiciary Committee. On January 27, 1874, Sumner issued one final impassioned plea to get his bill out of committee and to a full Senate vote. It would be his last great speech. This bill is an urgent necessity, he told the Senate. It is manifest every day in the outrages to which Black Americans are exposed, not only in travel and at hotels, but still more in the children of their homes who are shut out from those schools where they should benefit from full equality. Over the next few weeks, with his bill stuck in committee, Sumner's health rapidly declined. By March, he lingered in his sickbed, often too ill to appear in the Senate chamber. Yet even in his final hours, the old crusader refused to give up. You must take care of my civil rights bill, Sumner pleaded to visitors as he lay dying. My bill, the civil rights bill, don't let it fail. In the early hours of Sumner's last day, Frederick Douglass appeared at his bedside. Don't let the bill fail, Sumner whispered to his old friend, asking him to remain steadfast in the cause of civil rights. Charles Sumner died on March 11, 1874. 2 months later, apparently out of belated respect for their deceased colleague, the Senate passed the Civil Rights Bill and sent it to the House of Representatives for consideration. Action on a companion bill in the House was already underway, introduced 2 months earlier by Sumner's Massachusetts colleague, Benjamin Butler. This bill gives to no man any rights which he has not by law now, Butler insisted as House debate began. We propose simply to give to whoever has this right taken away from him the means of overriding that state of hostile legislation and of punishing the man who takes that right away from him. As House debate continued through 1874, those opposing the bill stated constitutional objections, but they did little to hide their racist agenda. Former Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens of Georgia, back in Congress in 1873, insisted that racial segregation was the natural order of the South. Virginia's John Harris proclaimed that segregation was a natural prejudice that God himself placed in the hearts of Southern children. To support the bill, the pioneering African-American members elected to the House during Reconstruction took the lead. Denouncing the former Confederate South Carolina Representative Robert Elliott, forcefully backed the constitutionality of the bill and concluded by listing the many contributions made by African Americans. The passage of this bill will determine the civil status not only of the Negro, he argued, but of any other class of citizens who may feel themselves discriminated against. As segregationists denied discrimination in their home districts, Black representatives countered with personal examples of racism. Joseph Rainey of South Carolina described his treatment on steamboats and railway lines. The law recognizes my right upon this floor as a lawmaker, noted James Rapier of Alabama. But there is no law to secure me an accommodation while traveling here to discharge my duties. The key point of contention in the House debate was desegregation of public schools. Barbara Lewis of Tennessee supported the bill, but warned that integrated schools would be unacceptable because people, simply as a matter of taste, have maintained separate schools. Such concerns prompted the addition of language calling for separate but equal school facilities. On February 4th, 1875, when the House finally voted on the bill, there were three competing versions: Sumner's bill, as passed by the Senate, the separate but equal House bill, and a third version that lacked any mention of public education at all. African American members lined up behind Sumner's bill. "I have no compromise to offer on this request," James Rapier remarked. "After all, this question resolves itself into this: either I am a man or I am not a man." In the end, the third version prevailed. All mention of public education, the issue closest to Sumner's heart, was dropped. The final bill made no effort to regulate public schools, but did provide equal access to some public accommodations and prohibited the exclusion of African Americans from juries. The Senate passed the House bill on February 27th, and President Ulysses Grant signed it into law on March 1st, 1875. Now, as you may know, even that conditional victory didn't last long. In 1883, the Supreme Court declared the law unconstitutional. Perhaps it was best that Sumner did not live to see that day. The passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was the climax of decades of activism by those who sought an end to racial discrimination. But what was the impact of this watered-down bill that remained in effect for only 8 years? In some cases, even in the South, judges and juries felt compelled to follow the law. The legal threat of fines or imprisonment prompted some business owners to comply. During those 8 years, Black citizens fought and won court cases. But for the most part, the law was either ignored or so narrowly interpreted that it had little effect. As historian Valeria Weaver noted in a 1969 article, the law's guarantee of civil rights and public accommodations was a practical failure. If the law in implementation had limited effect, however, its termination left an enduring legacy. By declaring the Civil Rights Act unconstitutional, the Supreme Court removed one of the few legal barriers to outright racial discrimination in public spaces, allowing for states, particularly in the South, to institute what came to be known as Jim Crow laws. According to Weaver, the Civil Rights Act, although not enhancing the position of Black Americans, at the very least had tended to maintain the status quo. With that barrier gone, things got worse very quickly. Within a decade of the 1883 decision, at least 8 Southern states passed laws to segregate all means of public transportation. In Maryland, with no law to dictate otherwise, a district court judge ruled that separate but equal accommodations were perfectly legal and preferred by a majority of white citizens. Delaware reaffirmed its laws to allow discrimination in hotels, inns, and restaurants. From the innumerable cases and incidents available, Weaver concluded, it is clear that Black Americans faced an acceleration of segregation in a number of states. The African American community expressed outrage at the 1883 court decision, complaining that it reaffirmed the infamous Dred Scott decision. Some called for passage of a new civil rights law, but they met with apathy, if not outright derision, in Congress. The best strategy, many thought, was to focus on the source of Jim Crow laws and turn their attention to establishing state-based civil rights laws using the Civil Rights Act of 1875 as the model. In the years that followed, nearly 20 states passed such laws patterned after Sumner's bill, limiting segregation in hotels, restaurants, theaters, and other places of public amusement. Working with hindsight, state lawmakers crafted bills to avoid constitutional pitfalls, although widespread disparity in interpretation remained. Discrimination did not end, of course, and in many areas, local officials and business owners went to great lengths to ensure that discrimination would continue. But in states with civil rights laws on the books, Black Americans at least had an avenue of legal recourse. The inherent conflict between these state-based laws and Jim Crow led ultimately to Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which made separate but equal the law of the land. So Charles Sumner's posthumous victory in 1875 was a tarnished success, and yet the Civil Rights Act of 1875 remains a milestone, a powerful symbolic reminder of what might have been, and a rallying cry for the activists who continue to fight for equal rights in the decades ahead. 8 decades would pass before the Supreme Court would call for school desegregation in the Brown versus Board decision. 82 years would pass until 1957 before another civil rights bill made it through the Southern-dominated Senate. Finally, in 1964, a monumental civil rights bill, one that echoed Sumner's bill, in fact, reiterated Sumner's bill in so many ways, became law. Nearly a century after Sumner proposed equality in schools and public accommodations, his vision was finally fulfilled, and then it faced its own challenges in implementation. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 is too often dismissed as a well-meaning failure, an assessment that doesn't do justice to its lasting legacy. Even in its diminished form, the 1875 laws set the stage for a legal battle over civil and social equality that has lasted for nearly 150 years. And it remained a point of reference for every civil rights bill that followed, up to and including the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Early failures often lead to future successes. Soon after passage of the '64 Civil Rights Law, one scholar looked back to Sumner. "It is a tragedy of our time," he wrote, "that the courts of Sumner's day failed to accept his wisdom, thereby requiring the present generation to re-win a victory which should have been secured in 1875. Critics of the 1875 law also fail to credit Sumner's untiring effort to pass a landmark bill. Sumner was an agitator. His proposals often were too radical to be adopted in his time, but he influenced much of the landmark legislation of his day. And Sumner was a visionary. He saw a future that few of his contemporaries could even contemplate. Senator Carl Schurz of Missouri, Sumner's close friend and colleague, said it well. Charles Sumner's mission in life, Schurz wrote, was to march ahead of his followers when they were afraid to follow. That brutal beating of 1856 made Charles Sumner famous, but it was the hard and the dedicated work that followed that truly deserves to be remembered. Thank you.
Thank you, Betty. That was fantastic. Good stuff. And for those of you who want to ask questions, I encourage you to submit them through the chat box. We at the Byrd Center have talked about this a good bit in our teacher institutes this year, and Jody developed a workshop for educators that really kind of focuses on Reconstruction more broadly. One of the things that interested me from the early part of your talk was Sumner's idea about sort of the psychic impact of discrimination and segregation. And I knew that the bill was far ahead of its time, but I didn't know that he was getting at some of those issues, which really lay at the heart of Brown v. Board. Can you talk a little bit about where that came from, and where, how was that received?
When Sumner was a young man, he studied at Harvard Law School. He studied under Joseph Story at Harvard Law, and Sumner really wanted to become a scholar. That was sort of his real aspiration. And so a lot of his arguments were often couched in legal scholarship of the time. And many of them do sort of foreshadow 20th century arguments, but he's one of the first that really sort of looks at the psychological aspects of discrimination. And exactly where that comes from is hard to pinpoint because he's one of the few that is talking about it at the time. But he did have, among other things, very close colleagues in the African American community. For instance, I didn't mention in this talk today, but one of the people he collaborated with in writing this bill was an important person who was the dean of Howard University Law School at the time. So he had many conversations with African Americans of his era, as well as African Americans in the early scholarship of that. And so I think a lot of it comes from those conversations and those experiences. But also his trips to Europe were really telling as well. That trip to France in the late 1830s was really pivotal, as I mentioned. And that's partly because he saw interactions among blacks and whites in very different ways than he saw them in the US. And all of these things kind of come together to create in his mind this idea that inferiority is imposed upon the black community, and that inevitably is going to have psychological impacts. He sometimes talked about how is there a good way to move beyond that, to bring African Americans beyond their imposed inferior status as slaves, for instance, to become active members of society. And he talked about education a lot, but he also talked about showing them respect, showing them attitudes of acceptance in ways that would be sort of a 20th century argument, that the damage is not only economic or physical, the damage is psychological as well.
Yeah, it's such a contemporary argument. So one of the questions from our audience: who were Sumner's close associates other than Douglas and Schertz and the dean from Howard that you mentioned?
It varies over time. One of his closest friends was Henry Longfellow. Most of his closest friends were not in politics. They were men of letters, people, the transcendentalist community, for instance, but Longfellow, Emerson later on. Joseph Story was an extremely important figure in his early life. And he had a couple law partners along the way that were really close friends as well. When he gets to the Senate, and there's a couple things going on that I didn't talk about today because we don't have time to go into everything, but by the time you get to the 1870s, Sumner is really on the outs of the party system. The Republican Party is going through massive change and turmoil in the 1870s, and Sumner is really a harsh critic of the Grant administration, and by this time he's very much ostracized from the Republican caucus, to the point where in an incident they remove him from his chairmanship of the Foreign Relations Committee. At another time, at the time of the 1872 election, he actually leaves the party to become a member of the new third party, the Liberal Republicans, to oppose Grant. So by the time you get to the time where he's pushing this bill, he doesn't have a lot of party support. And that is in part because he doesn't have those kinds of friendships within the Senate. Carl Schurz is one of the few in the Senate that he's really close to. Most of the senators found him to be arrogant and unwilling to compromise, unbending, and he was all of those things. He was not a pleasant person to be around most of the time. As he got older, he got more stubborn and more arrogant, so he created a lot of enemies in that way. But his really true friends were more in the literary community, and I would put Longfellow at the top of the list probably. Schurz is one of the few within the Senate. Henry Wilson, his colleague from Massachusetts, who's a much less famous senator from Massachusetts than Sumner. He was overshadowed by Sumner. But Henry Wilson was also a great abolitionist and was the author of the 1862 D.C. Emancipation Act. And those two were not necessarily close social friends, but they were really close colleagues in the Senate and worked together very well, right up into the end of Sumner's life. So there were a few, but most of them were outside of politics.
Do you, in sort of looking at his speeches and, do you see that kind of literary influence? Was he a great orator? Did he kind of bring that? I mean,
he was one of the great orators of the time. And he approached his oratory in a very scholarly way. When he delivered his famous Crime Against Kansas speech in 1856, and I will draw your attention to a couple others. This January of 1874 speech that I mentioned is his last great speech. Is really a brilliant and wonderful speech of its own. He also, in the midst of that 1872 presidential election, when Grant was running for re-election, he delivered a wonderful speech that he called Grantism versus Republicanism. And he's talking about the downfall of the Republican Party at this particular time. And it's a wonderfully constructed speech. But he attacked these in a very scholarly way. He would do massive amounts of research. Then he would write up hundreds and hundreds of pages for a speech, which he would then take and completely memorize. For his 1856 speech went over 2 days. It lasted for hours over 2 days, and he memorized every word of it. And that was the way he approached oratory. And he was one of the great speakers of the day.
That's interesting. I thought somebody had a question. A lot of thank yous are coming in, and accolades and all of that sort of stuff. One of the things that kind of struck me too, and as we're waiting for more questions to come in, please submit them. I always kind of sense that, his desire to see at the end of his life, to see it past, is this sort of fear that he will pass and the effort will die. But of course, it's only really 2 years prior to what we generally recognize as the end of Reconstruction. Was there a sense with Sumner or other members of the Senate at the time that the political will to keep Reconstruction going was really sort of approaching the ledge, so to speak?
I think there was. I mean, one of the reasons the amnesty bill gets through is because even the Northern Republicans were just growing restive and weary with Reconstruction. They were getting tired of the fight, and they were willing to make compromises in 1874 that they weren't willing to make in 1868, for instance. I also think that for Sumner, it wasn't really an issue of Reconstruction. I don't think Sumner would have seen it in a time period the way many people did. I mean, certainly not the way we look back on it now. For Sumner, this is the same crusade he had been battling for about 40 years by this time period. So even though there were key legislations of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, the 1866 law, for example, key moments of legislative victory along the way, he would have seen it in a much broader framework. He would have seen this as a continuation of what he was doing in the 1850s and the 1860s, and then all the way up into his death. So I don't think he saw it as much in terms of Reconstruction. Rather, it was in terms of how do we fulfill that guiding principle of all men are created equal. There were many others around him, of course, who were more in tune to the Reconstruction time frame, and were much more willing to let things slide as they could find compromises to move on.
It seems like he paid a pretty high sort of personal toll for all of this. Who are the people who either in Congress or outside of it that kind of pick up his torch essentially after he passes?
Really no one. In the Senate, there's no one. In the House side, we have the early African-American members who carry this on for a while, but then, as you probably know, they disappear, and there are no African-American members for quite a few years into the 1920s on the House side. On the Senate side, we get Blanche K. Bruce comes in the 1870s, but once he leaves, we don't get another African American in the Senate until the 1960s when Ed Brooke of Massachusetts comes in. So it's certainly not an African American member that can appear and carry it forward. When you get into the early 20th century, and the issues begin to morph, you know, in the wake of Plessy versus Ferguson, there's a lot less attention given to how to create laws of desegregation and more towards other issues of civil rights. For the Senate community, the main issue of the early 20th century is not desegregation, but anti-lynching bills. So if I had to draw a line, I would probably draw it from the 1875 Civil Rights Bill to the really concerted efforts by certain people like Colorado Senator Edward Costigan, New York Senator Robert Wagner, who are really trying by the 1920s, 30s to pass anti-lynching bills. So that becomes the great civil rights issue of the pre-World War II era. Not until the post-World War II era do you really get concerted efforts to pass new civil rights laws. And then we have a new set of people, Hubert Humphrey, Tommy Kuchel, these people that carry it forward in the 60s to the passage of the 64 Civil Rights Law. But there are long periods of time when you'd be hard put to find someone in the Senate who is really battling these issues on a daily basis the way Sumner did in the 1860s and 70s. He had a few colleagues, like Henry Wilson was one, but Henry Wilson died in 1875. There were a few others of the late 19th century that looked for ways to get around Jim Crow laws and that kind of stuff, but they were few and far between in the Senate at that time.
You mentioned that he was chair was at Foreign Relations, and so was this kind of like a single-minded kind of approach, or did he have other kind of legislative interests beyond this?
That's actually a really good idea, a really good question, because Sumner was very vested in foreign policy issues. He was chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, and during the war years, he had a pivotal role to play in some issues like the Trent Affair, which was a diplomatic crisis during the Civil War. Sumner really carries the Senate through that process. He's also very instrumental in the Alaska Purchase Treaty, getting the Alaska Purchase Treaty approved and passed through. And so really very much geared towards foreign policy issues. And that's partly because he had traveled much more widely than most of the members at that time. He was fluent in 4 or 5 different languages. You know, he knew diplomats from other countries. That was very much a part of his personality. And it was also part of his scholarly aspect. For instance, when he was studying the Alaska Purchase Treaty, he spent weeks and weeks just like pulling books from the Library of Congress, studying every aspect he could about the wildlife of the Alaska Territory, the fauna, the flora, the trees, the plants. You know, he became an expert on the Alaska Territory, so that when he went to the Senate, he was able to really put forth a very strong argument in favor of that purchase. So foreign policy becomes a real key issue. Now, in the 1870s, he battles the Grant administration, particularly over Grant's desire to annex Santo Domingo. And it's really over that argument that the Senate caucus, the Republican caucus, gets fed up with him and removes him from his chairmanship. And that was a big deal at the time. It was a huge blow to Sumner at the time, and it got a lot of attention in the press and otherwise. But civil rights weren't his only issue. He wasn't a one-trick pony kind of guy. He had other issues, but this was the one that is just a string that carries throughout his entire lifespan.
Yeah, that's certainly the one that he's most known for. Marie has asked, what did he think of sort of American industrialization, which is really beginning to kind of take root during this period? Is he interested in this at all? I mean, he's from Massachusetts.
He is from Massachusetts, but that's a good question too. And I haven't come across much from Sumner about industrialization, and so I don't know that he was that invested in it. I think he was more interested in the social consequences of that rather than the business aspects of it. That's an interesting thought, though. I'll have to dig into that and look, because I don't know. I don't have a good answer to that.
Yeah. I mean, just because even Massachusetts, it's one of the, Boston area is one of those places where you sort of see the proto-industrialization taking place. Ray asked, well, he said, great talk, Betty, but also, is there any art in the Capitol that honors Sumner?
There's a little bit. We have a statue of Sumner, and we have a bust of Sumner, and there's a portrait of Sumner that hangs in the corridor right outside the Senate chamber. So, and speaking of artwork, Ray, here's another aspect of Sumner's career that is kind of lesser known. In 1865, the Senate had there was a Senate resolution put forth to commission the bust of Chief Justice Roger Taney, the bust that now stands in the old Supreme Court chamber in the U.S. Capitol. And when I'm trying to remember who proposed the resolution, and I can't think of it right now, but when that resolution was proposed, Sumner stood up and opposed it. And the sponsor said, even though he declared this Dred Scott decision, he was still a great and learned man. To which Sumner responded that throughout the years to come, his name is going to go down in the history books as one of the great villains of U.S. history. And he spoke very strongly against commissioning that bust. Strongly enough that he was able to undermine the resolution at that time period. And it took another 20 years for them to get a resolution through that brought the Taney bust in. Now they're talking about whether or not the Taney bust should be removed from the collection for reasons you all know too well. And so that took me back to Sumner's speech about that, because he was well ahead of his time. So we do have artwork in the Senate art collection that features Sumner.
So big question to take us back to the beginning. Do tours in the Capitol still kind of end with he sort of went his merry way after his beating?
Well, when you hear staff-led, now I will say the Capitol guides who do tours of the Capitol do a very good job. So the tours I have a problem with are those that are led by staff, and more importantly, those that are led by members of Congress. Those tend to be the least accurate of all, and you hear the wildest stories from members of Congress. That particular one was a young staffer, and I did pull him aside afterwards to say there's actually a lot more to that story, and Sumner did not give up and go home. Yeah. But I hear this kind of stuff all the time. It drives me crazy, as you can imagine. And sometimes if it's egregious enough, like for instance, there was the time I was walking through the basement of the Russell building, and there was a staffer leading a group of constituents, and they were asking him about how the Washington, D.C. came to be placed in the location it is. And the staffer went into a long explanation explaining about how because the South won the Civil War, the South was able to choose the location for the Capitol. And it went on from there. And there are times when it's so egregious that I have to step in and say, actually, that's not true. And here's the real story. Most of the time I try not to step on staff toes and I let it go, but sometimes you have to step in. But as I mentioned in my talk, I have worked with the Capitol Guide Service. I have worked with the Capitol Visitor Center to try to work towards a new interpretation of the old Senate chamber. One that doesn't just use the caning of Sumner as this dramatic moment, but rather something that puts that into the broader context of the story and the biography of Sumner. I've also worked to get them to dump this whole concept of a golden age of the Senate in the pre-Civil War era, which is a total myth, and to really look at the complicated aspects of the Senate of that story. Now, they only have a few minutes to tell these stories, I understand, but in those few minutes, we can use that time to give them a little better sense of what the Senate was like in the 1830s, 40s, or 50s. So that's an ongoing battle, and probably one I will never fully win. And my predecessors didn't win either, and my successors probably won't completely win, but we keep trying. We do our best.
Yeah. So a lot of people are really interested in Sumner, and the question has come up a couple times. If you can recommend a good biography or broader
Mhm.
work that focuses on Sumner and his work.
Interestingly, Sumner has not got a lot of attention from scholars in recent years. The best biography of him is still David Herbert Donald's biography, Sumner and the Rights of Man. And he wrote a couple of biographies and then he put them together into kind of a combined book at one point. And I still recommend that book. There's the first volume on Sumner and the Coming of the Civil War is good. That covers the caning episode and that type of thing. But also the second one on Sumner and the Rights of Man really looks at the latter part of his career and his focus on civil rights legislation. That's still worth reading. There's an early biography of Sumner written by a man named Moorfield Story. And Story was actually a staffer of Sumner's at one point, worked with Sumner on the Hill, and then later on in the 1890s wrote a biography that's kind of a memoir of his time with Sumner, but it's actually really quite good. There hasn't been a great biography of Sumner in the last 40, 50 years, which is really needs to be done. There are several really good articles, however, that have come out starting in the wake of the passage of the '64 Civil Rights Act, and I mentioned a couple of those in my talk, but also in the last 20 years or so, there have been a few good scholarly articles that really have looked at Sumner and the Civil Rights Bill. And so I would add those two. I could always pass those on to you, Jay, if you want to share those with people.
Yeah, please
I
do.
can pass those citations on.
And for any of you who are, interested, just you can, reach me at the Byrd Center or send me an email or and I'll be happy to pass them along. It is striking, my own work really focuses more on the recent past and kind of looking into all of this, and Jody's talk over the summer. It's just striking how much of the Sumner's bill, his act is in the 1964 Act. It's
big sections of it. Yeah. I mean, and that's another part of the story that I think should be explored more. And I've only had a little bit of time to really dig into that. But in the debate over the '64 Civil Rights Act, there were people, particularly Everett Dirksen, but there were people who were really working to shape that bill so that it would pass constitutional muster. Mm-hmm. And one of the things they did was to look back at the 1875 law and the 1883 court case to really look at how they could avoid the pitfalls of that bill and get a bill that would not be declared unconstitutional. So not only were entire passages of Sumner's bill put into the '64 law, but they were really using it in many ways as a model of what to do and what not to do in order to maintain constitutionality. So I think that part of the story really needs to be explored a lot more than it has so far. We did that a little bit a couple of years ago when we were commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act and the '64 Act. But it was clear to me at that time that's a story that scholars really need to dig into and just see what those connections over that 90-year period really are. I think that would be an interesting story.
Well, from both sides too, right? I mean, are those who are opposing it using essentially the same arguments coming, just fast forwarded, 90 years or whatever later?
There are a lot of familiar arguments. When you're reading the Congressional Globe, this debate happens in that moment when we're moving from the Congressional Globe to the Congressional Record in 1873. So as you're reading those arguments from the Congressional Globe and then the Congressional Record, there are so many arguments that ring true to us today. In both from the proponents and the opponents side. And as you're reading those arguments, you think, wait a minute, I heard that last week. I heard someone say something like that last week. It's the argument that has never gone out of our public debate, and obviously continues to be a huge part of our public discourse today.
Yeah, no doubt about that. Does anybody have any final questions for Betty? This has been a really fantastic talk and an enlightening one. And as I begin my classes here at Shepherd this semester and trying to get students to understand the relevance of this kind of thing and exactly the point that you just made, these are contemporary conversations just said 150 years ago, which speaks volumes in a lot of different ways. But thank you so much, Betty. This has been a fantastic talk and really, really informative.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. And I appreciate all of you joining us today. It's very nice of you to give us some time today.